Well, Tariqa is there as a means to an end. We all know our tendency to forgetfulness, to sin, to pride, to arrogance, and we all realize that perhaps our number one task is to rectify the intention and to rectify the purity of our hearts. And unfortunately, one finds, even amongst people who outwardly seem to be quite religious, that inwardly their akhlaq are not very good, that they shout at people a lot, they're not very good in their domestic lives, and outwardly they seem to shine with all of the outward forms of Islam and the beard and the beautiful headgear, but actually they're quite disagreeable people. And that's a problem, and in a sense we're all like that to a greater or lesser extent. So Tariqa is historic Islam's spiritual technology. It's a kind of psychological medicine. And I recall the oddity of dealing with some adversaries of the Tariqa principle, who at the first don't understand what it is. That I say, if you have a mental illness or a sort of obsessive-compulsive disorder or a problem like that, what do you do about it? And he says, well, of course I go to the doctor, and he uses Freudian psychology and some atheistic worldview that understands myself. Well, that's a rather unfortunate view for a Muslim to take, that they regard the spiritual side of us as essentially a secular realm that can be dealt with in terms of secular, ultimately non-Muslim understandings of the self as a purely material phenomenon. But when you go to Islam's psychology, which has always 100% of the time been under the banner of what we call tasawwuf or tariqa, people immediately become anxious. So they prefer something that is based on shirk and kufr to something that is based on tawheed and dhikrullah. Now, of course, everything is subject to the mizan, to the balance of the sharia, and whenever there is a practice in one of the tariqas that might be disputed in terms of sharia, it's for the muftis to resolve that. But alhamdulillah, we find that one of the things that the ummah has been overwhelmingly agreed on throughout history is that this inner life, this science of purifying the niyyah, which is, as I've suggested, really the trigger for, or the context for, Allah's granting of his victory, when the ummah is inwardly as well as outwardly beautiful, is something that is absolutely axiomatically a part of Islam. So the traditional texts that you learn at Al-Azhar or the traditional madrasas in Syria, Uzbekistan and throughout the Islamic world will always, in my experience, emphasize the necessity of following a path in tariqah. Otherwise you're left to your own devices in trying to sort out your own inner demons, and we don't really have the strength to deal with them. We need this spiritual technology that the great sheikhs throughout the ages have gifted us with.
Thank you.